Hey everyone, Hannah Liebreich here for Social Women Studies 452 Marriage and Family Feminist Perspectives. So today, my video is going to be a little bit different for week 7. Typically, I provide a brief overview about what we're covering this for the week. But for week 7, we're really honing in on the theory doing gender. And this is a theory I used quite liberally in my master's thesis. So I want to give you a little bit more of a lecture style video this week to sort of demonstrate to folks how I applied the theory of doing gender that you're learning about this week to original data I collected for my thesis. This is a conference presentation I gave of that project about 5 years ago here in Hawaii at the Hawaii Sociological Association. So another benefit of this more lecture style video is that you'll get to see how I write and how I organize my thoughts for conference presentations and papers and that sort of thing, which will hopefully help you as you work on your full draft of your final paper for this class, which is due next week, week 8. So let's go ahead and get started. The title of my conference presentation is Doing Gender, Doing Fights, a qualitative exploration of gender and fighting at party schools and commuter schools. All right, so first I start with an overview, letting my audience know what topics I'll be covering throughout the presentation. So I'm going to cover key terms. I'm going to explain the significance of the study. I'm going to get a little bit into the literature that I relied on for the purpose of the project. I'll describe my methods, and then I'll get into the findings, ending with my conclusions and final thoughts about the project. Key terms. So one thing I learned early on in this project is that I really needed to define what I mean by fight, because when I did a pilot study at another school, when I was talking about fighting on the college campus, folks were confused as to whether I meant physical fights or if I meant verbal fighting. So for the purpose of this project, when I say fighting, I mean a physical attack without a clear victim or perpetrator, which is important because if there's a clear victim or perpetrator, then that's a different type of physical violence that I'm not interested in for this project. All right. And then the study that I did for my MA thesis was at a party school. Party schools can be described by their student-regulated culture, including extreme drinking and risky behaviors such as drug use and having a lot of sexual partners. And then I also think through whether or not this fighting type of behavior would occur on other types of schools, such as commuter schools. And so commuter schools are places where students are unlikely to live in university-owned housing, where students are more likely to commute to campus. So if you think about the University of Hawaii at Manoa, which pretty much all of you go to, that's a commuter school. We don't have very many dorms, and we don't really have Greek houses where folks are living. All right, continuing on, so I'm really interested in the way masculinity and femininity sort of manifest in these physical fights. So it's really important that I define what I mean by masculinity and femininity. And so what I'm talking about for masculinity is the appropriate gender norms for boys and men. And so how we as a society construct those gender norms sort of represents masculinity. And masculinity can change in terms of how a society understands masculinity, so can femininity. But at the end of the day, within all societies, what we're talking about is appropriate gender norms for boys and men with masculinity, and for femininity, we're talking about girls and women. So you can see that the definition for femininity is similar. It's the appropriate gender norms for girls and women. All right. And then I'm also going to be talking a lot about reputation in this presentation, because one of the things I argue is that folks who participate in physical fights on their college campus, their peers and other students believe that the act of physically getting into a fight is helping to build and defend their reputation, specifically with regard to gender and masculinity and femininity. So I define reputation as a socially constructed marker or markers assigned to individuals based on their behavior, events, and that sort of thing. All right. This here is a video that someone sent me while I was collecting the data for my MA thesis. This is a group brawl that occurred on the street of that the campus was situated on. So the person who was filming this video would be standing in front of a building I used to teach in. And then you have the street, and then the side of the street that the students are on is Greek Row. So that's where all of the Greek houses are, where students potentially live. And so you can already see here that there's empty beer cans on the ground. You're seeing that people are going to be getting pretty aggressive with each other. And also note that this is during the day because it's daylight out. I'll go ahead and show you what this looks like.
Let's go! Let's go, front row!
So this is a group brawl where multiple people are involved, but you can sort of see that there are some individual one-on-one fights occurring, and that's really what I'm looking at. But this is a good example of what the fights I'm talking about for the purpose of this project look like, in case you've never seen that type of physical violence on your campus or any campus. All right. Moving on. I'm having some technical difficulties. Sorry, hang in there with me. All right. Okay. So the significance of this project is that what I was noticing was that violent behavior, so these physical fights, was being normalized by students. And that's pretty problematic. So that was a concern for me. Plus, in the student newspaper, there were people writing opinion pieces about the fact that they were concerned about the risky behavior and the physical violence occurring on their campus because of the party culture that exists. We also know from quantitative data that when it comes to these types of physical fights, that there's a high risk of injury, about 41% to be exact. So I'm really looking at, and the purpose of the project was to look at high risk and normalized behavior. So there's lots of literature on party schools. We know that party school culture is perpetuated in the media, and that fighting is merely one of many risky behaviors associated with this context. Fights occur between men and women, and to a certain degree, but definitely more so with fights between men, the behavior is normalized. It's very common, according to other studies that take place on college campuses. And then in terms of commuter schools, there are cultural differences. So if we're comparing and contrasting party schools versus commuter schools, they're both educating students, but commuter schools are less likely to have students on campus and between classes. They're less likely to have students involved in extracurricular activities and that sort of thing. And that's just to name a few. There's much more literature on that if folks are interested. All right. So doing gender is the idea that gender is within all social interactions. So we're constantly doing gender. We're also, when we think about doing gender, we're thinking about the way in which gender is socially constructed. And so a social construction is something that, so events or ways of acting that are socially agreed upon behavior. I won't get too much into power discourse and hegemonic masculinity and emphasize femininity, but this is the idea I referred to previously when I was talking about masculinity and femininity. It's this idea that ideas of masculinity and femininity can vary cross-culturally, but there's always a sort of ideal way of doing masculinity and femininity within each society. So even if that varies, there is going to be like that ideal agreed upon masculinity and femininity. All right, in terms of methods, I conducted 3 focus groups with 14 participants total at a large Eastern university from the academic school year of 2013 to 2014. Each focus group lasted approximately 2 hours. You can also see here the gender, age, and race makeup. If you look at that versus the overall student population, you'll see that women were overrepresented, minority groups were overrepresented, and younger folks were overrepresented. But that kind of makes sense because when you hear the word gender, women are more likely to be interested in those types of studies. when we're thinking about partying, that tends to attract younger freshman, sophomore students. And I'm not sure about the race component, but I'm not sure why that happened, but there was some discrepancy there. So just important to notate. In terms of the questions I asked during the focus groups, you can sort of read through here. Ooh, whoops. What types of questions I was likely to ask. Sorry, technical difficulties. And again, whenever I'm presenting original data that I collect, I always give examples of the questions I ask participants. All right. So the key findings for men, I learned that college men fight to prove their masculinity and to perform appropriate masculine norms. And then the one exception there was that if and when men lost fights and they were getting emotional, they were crying, they were visibly upset, that could be problematic for their masculine reputation. And so they had to find some way to sort of negotiate that situation of losing. And that's something that men don't ever want to do when they get into these physical fights. So here's some data from the study. You can read, if you're known as a guy that wins fights, like my roommate's been in 5 or 6 fights now, he's won every one, and he's known as, in the frat, he's known as the super cool guy, and oh, he's a fighter, and he's really big and tough. And then another participant said, yeah, I think if you're connected to thinking you're a big, tough caveman, then yeah, fighting would have. Like you said, it's connected to masculinity. You need to be manly. I bet if you lose a fight, I bet that would really hurt emotionally. And then for women, I learned that women also fight to demonstrate appropriate feminine norms. So when they're engaging in these physical fights, they're making sure that they're verbally insulting their opponent beforehand. They're prolonging that tension before the physical fight. And then after the physical fight, they feel the need to explain and justify their behavior. So there are some caveats and nuances to women who get into these physical fights when compared to their male counterparts. And then again, there's an exception. So participants explain that if women self-identified as quote-unquote ratchet or not very classy, then they might not need to explain their behavior in terms of getting into physical fights. So one participant said, a feminine trait is to be more passive, and I feel like a lot of female fights, they had been personally attacked verbally beforehand, such as, oh, she called me a bitch. Well, I can't have people thinking that it's okay for her to call me a bitch, or I need to do something about this. And then another participant said, the way I look at fighting with women is I just don't think it's very reputable. I just don't think it's a very classy thing. But I know some girls that will. I know this one girl who will label herself as ratchet. That's part of her identity, and she's proud of it. She would be more proud to get in a fight than I would. All right, so overall, in terms of this project and the data I presented, I'm saying that often traditional notions of gender norms persist, and these physical fights on college campuses are one way in which those norms perpetuate on college campuses. However, there are exceptions, and so that leads me to suggest this question, the third bullet point, are there perhaps alternative forms of masculinity and femininity available to college students? So are they able to sort of break stereotypical gender norms by engaging in some of this risky behavior, but more specifically fights, physical fights? And then again, because I am comparing and contrasting party schools versus commuter schools, are these findings unique to party schools? Or are there also alternative forms of masculinity and femininity on other typologies, such as commuter schools? So in order to answer that question, I would, of course, need to do future research on other types of college campuses, but this study is quite old now, and I don't have plans to do that. And then, of course, I cite everything. So that's just one way I applied the concept of doing gender by Weston Zimmerman to original data. This, of course, doesn't have much to do with our topic of of marriage and family, but I hope it allows you to think through how you might be able to apply that theory, as well as other theory we've covered this semester, to concepts related to marriage and family. Have a great week, guys.